sinus node arrhythmias, atrial arrhythmias. I'm not muted here. Okay, sure. Okay, so sinus node arrhythmias, atrial arrhythmias, and junctional node arrhythmias. And tomorrow we'll be discussing about ventricular arrhythmias, heart blocks, bundle branch blocks, and then we'll go through a little bit on these ones, antiarrhythmics and management of arrhythmias, that sort of thing. We'll go through tomorrow. Okay, yeah. So we won't, without taking long, we'll start. So just to refresh ourselves on like the basic electrophysiology of the heart. So I'll go through this section pretty quickly. So as you know, like the heart, like the impulses, they start in the sinoatrial node, and then they descend down to the so sinoatrial node is the dominant pacemaker of the heart. Okay, so then they descend down into the AV node through these ones. So there's these like three internodal tracts, the middle one, posterior one, and the anterior one. And there's also another one called the Bachmann's bundle, which goes into the right atrium. And after that, in the atrioventricular node, there's a little bit of a delay. The AV nodal delay is there. And after that, they conduct down the His-Purkinje system, so the bundle of His, and then down to the left and right bundle branches, and then along the ventricular myocardium. And another important thing to realize here is, so one thing is this one. So when you take the cross section of the heart, these Purkinje fibers, they are actually located pretty close to the lumen of the heart. So like they are located just below the endothelium vagetama, you have these Purkinje fibers. And so all of the impulses after the Purkinje fibers, they reach they spread outwards along the myocardium. So that will be important later on. So just keep that point in mind. Okay. Yeah. And another thing. So now, how does this conduction happen here? So when you take these ones, so basically like these Purkinje cells and the cardiac myocytes, both of them are derived from the same type of cell. So they have this basic similar structure. Both of them have. But the thing is, when you take the Purkinje system cells, those are actually more geared towards conduction. They don't have contractile fibers. They are more geared towards conduction. So therefore, those are larger cells, and those have larger gap junctions as well. So basically, the impulse spreads faster through Purkinje fibers. And when you take the myocytes, which are in here, those are smaller cells as in, they are smaller and more geared towards contraction. And they have a lesser amount of gap junctions, so impulses spread through them pretty slowly. So so if you take the absolute rate, so the Purkinje cells, they conduct impulses 6 times faster than the myocardial cells. Just keep that point in mind because that will be important later on. Okay, and so these are the gap junctions through which impulses flow. And another thing to keep in mind is this one. So how exactly do these ion charges flow from cell to cell? So here, before talking about that, let's just talk about this thing. These two action potentials in the pacemaker cells and the cardiac myocytes. Okay, so basically the pacemaker cells, SA node is the dominant one, and if you take the rates of it, the SA node has the dominant rate, that is 60 to 100 beats per minute. So that is what sets the heart rate. And all of the other cells, so almost every cell in the heart has an intrinsic pacemaker activity, but the rates of them are lower. So next up is the atrial muscle, and then AV node, His-bundle branches, Purkinje fibers, ventricular muscle. All of them have intrinsic pacemaker activity, but they are lower than the SA node. So SA node is the one which dictates the rhythm of the heart, and we call that overdrive suppression. Basically, it suppresses all of the other pacemakers. This is important because sometimes the SA node, so then other pacemakers start getting active and they start dictating things on their own. So the overdrive suppression becomes lost. So that will be important in certain types of arrhythmias. We'll talk about that later as well. If we go through like this one, the action potential of the pacemaker cell very briefly. So there it only has 3 phases, 4, 0 and 3. There is no 1 and 2 phase. Contrast that with this one, the cardiac myocyte. There it has 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 phases. All of them are there. But in the pacemaker cell, 1 and 2 phases are missing. Okay? So we start with phase 4. In phase 4, what happens is there's an automatic sodium current coming into the cell, and that comes through the HCN channel. That's called the hyperpolarization gated cyclic nucleotide channel. So what basically happens there is when the cell hyperpolarizes, when it goes into a very negative state, when the membrane potential goes into a very negative state, this starts getting active. And then the channel opens and sodium starts flowing into the cell. And then the membrane starts depolarizing. So you start going a little bit up. Okay? So you go along like this. And then what happens is when that reaches a certain threshold, T-type calcium channels also get active. And then calcium also starts flowing into the cell, and the cell depolarizes even further. Like the negativity becomes less and less. And when you hit minus 40, then what happens is that then you get the activation of L-type calcium channels, these ones. L-type calcium channels, they are rapidly conducting channels. So they, once you hit minus 40, all of them start opening very rapidly, and you get a very rapid spike in the flow of ions. So calcium starts flowing very fast into the cell, and then the cell, the membrane potential shoots up until plus 10 wage level, it shoots up. So this minus 40 level that we call the pacemaker potential, it's called this. That's where spontaneous depolarization happens. That is also known as the pacemaker potential. So at around say 0 millivolts, the L-type calcium channel gets deactivated, and then the potassium channels start getting active. Now the thing is, potassium ions, the concentration of potassium ions is high inside the cells. So they have a concentration gradient to the outside. So then potassium starts flowing out, and then you get a repolarization again. And then it falls down, and then it goes up until minus 60 it becomes hyperpolarized, and then again what happens, the HCN channel gets active again because it's hyperpolarized, and then the sodium channel opens again, and sodium flows back in, and the cycle then starts again. So that is basically how this thing works, like the pacemaker potential, how that works is basically like that. Now, another thing to keep in mind, another thing to keep in mind is this thing. What is that? And so, why exact? Now, using this, we can also explain why exactly is the SA node the dominant node here. That happens because SA node has the highest, compared to other cells in the heart, SA node has the highest number of sodium channels and T-type calcium channels. And because of that, the slope is highest in the SA node. Anith kattiyage slope it's like this. Menna මේ වගේ තමයි අනිත් කට්ටියගේ slopes තියෙන්නේ. So එතකොට මෙයාගේ තමයි slope එක highest, that's why it has the most rapid rate. Simply because it has the highest number of HCN channels and T-type calcium channels. Okay, so that's another important point to keep in mind. Okay, what else? So that's it about the SA node. And another method. So now then again, sympathetic stimulation, adrenaline, noradrenaline, those things, they can increase the heart rate. How exactly does that happen? We can explain using this one. Basically what happens there is, these epinephrine and norepinephrine, they come and bind to G-protein coupled receptors in the SA node. Then what happens is that through a cascade, it ultimately triggers the activation of it. Basically opens up these sodium channels and T-type calcium channels. But this opens them up even more. Then what happens is that this slope goes up even further. We have L-type calcium channels. So the slope becomes like this. Then another thing that it does is it opens up these potassium channels as well. The repolarization is faster. Slope slope inclined. So basically that is how that increases heart rate. See how sympathetic stimulation increases the heart rate. The vagus nerve does the exact opposite. They close those channels, and therefore the heart rate goes down. Okay? So that is how the autonomic nervous system acts on the heart. Similar thing also happens in the AV node as well. එතකොට AV node එකේ තියෙන basically AV node එකේ යන්නේ මෙන්න මේ same kind of action potential එකක් තමයි යන්නේ. So then what happens is that when sympathetic stimulation acts on that one, එතන channels open වෙලා ඒකේ conduction rate එකක් වැඩි වෙනවා. එතකොට therefore like the conduction to the AV node becomes faster. That is why it's called positive dromotropy. Right? So SA node එකේ you get positive chronotrophy. And method of the AV node, you get positive dromotrophy. So that is another important principle to keep in mind. So then what happens is that, so the SA node we generated this action potential and it flows down this conduction pathway. And conduction pathway flow down vegan young. Be another important thing to keep in mind. How depolarization happens here. So you have a sodium channel. Sodium channel. Another thing to keep in mind is that when cells, these cells also function similarly to conduction system, not the nodal cells, but conduction system. Is fiber system and internodal fibers action potential those are pretty similar to the cardiac myocyte action potential. Okay, cardiac myocyte action potential it's pretty similar. Then what happens is that here what happens is then cardiac action potential then maybe resting state action potential sodium channels open very rapidly and the membrane potential shoots up. So we'll talk about that later, but that is basically what happens. So the methana you have these maybe there are sodium channels the may thing in a positive charge positive charge sodium channel open and then sodium starts flowing in. And sodium then becomes positive. Sodium channel activated. Sodium channel basically positive charge membrane once it comes from the inside, that gets depolarized. Once it hits a certain threshold, it opens, sodium flows into the cell. That area becomes positive, and then the adjacent sodium channel gets activated. So that's basically how the action potential flows along the cell. What happens when it reaches another cell? The methanol, there's a gap junction. So the methanol B, what happens is, so the methanol sodium channel now so make a depolarize on a sodium comes into the cell. Then may area becomes positive. The sodium channels gap junctions they flow into the adjacent cell. Once they flow into the adjacent cell, then becomes positive. So the sodium channel it again becomes activation threshold hit make open sodium starts flowing in. That is how the conduction of action potentials along the conduction system happens. So this is the conducting system. Ultimately they come to a myocyte. Myocyte contraction fibers but the speed is lower. Remember, CRISPR system speed is 6 times faster than the conduction speed among cardiac myocytes. Very make conduction speed. Okay, I told that because that will become important later. Then okay, now it hits the cardiac myocyte. Then what happens? Then basically what happens is now action potential so the cardiac action potential cardiac myocyte normal resting membrane potential that's like -90. Then make now once the adjacent myocyte is depolarized, like membrane not the myocyte, but once the sodium channel next to the this sodium channel is depolarized, now you get a positive charge. Then the membrane potential starts drifting to about -70. Then -70 -70 minimum sodium channels, they get activated. Minus 70 again, that's their activation threshold. So once that's activated, they open very rapidly, and then maybe get a membrane potential shoots up to like plus 20 millivolts again. It shoots up. So that this happens through fast sodium channels. So to make a minus 90 will maintain potassium rectifier channels. So actually potassium concentration is high, so it pushes them up to the outside and keeps the membrane potential negative. Then what happens is once it hits minus 20, so fast sodium channels get deactivated. So their voltage, again, activation, it's dependent on voltage. At a certain voltage, they get active. At a certain voltage, they become inactive. So when make a plus 20, they become inactive. Then what happens? Then these channels open. Transient potassium channels open. Then potassium flows outside the cell, to the outside. Positive charges go out from the cell, and therefore the membrane potential becomes negative. But that doesn't happen because there's a feature unique to cardiac myocyte, and that is the calcium channel. Right? Again, L-type calcium channel. Sorry guys, I think my data went. Mona hari the man never to me. Can anyone tell Mona hari the man never to me? Anyways, come. There was it was a navigator. So basically what I was saying was again, potassium flows outside the cell, calcium flows into the cell, and this sort of balances out, and the membrane potential remains at kind of a stable phase. So that's called the plateau phase. So this is at around plus 20 plus 10 plus 10 millivolt range. But once it slowly decreases down to 0 millivolt range, the calcium channels shut down. Once calcium channels shut down, potassium channels shut down, but potassium channels, they still are open. Then potassium flows out, and then membrane potential starts going down very quickly. So that is phase 3. So calcium channels close, but they didn't rectify potassium channels. They remain open and retain the membrane and return the membrane potential to minus 90 millivolts. So that is basically how the myocyte action potential works. Another important concept to talk about is the refractory periods. Refractory period, what happens is this. So there are 3 refractory periods. There's the absolute refractory period, effective refractory period, and the relative refractory period. Then we need this one. We need to know about the how the sodium channel functions. How exactly? Sorry, may not I didn't have enough time to complete this one, so that's why I wasn't able to share it. Looks ugly, but yeah, barely. Okay. Yeah. So another thing. So the sodium channel behavior again we need to know as well. Again, we did this. So we did this already. But again, let's just refresh ourselves. So this is the voltage gated sodium channel, and that is the one which gives rise to phase 0. sharp spike එක වෙන්නේ මෙන්න මේ fast sodium channel එක නිසා. So what happens here? The මෙතනදී මෙතනදී වෙන්නේ yeah. So then make a voltages ගත්තා මම. එළියට look, I have a better picture of this one. Give me a second. maybe this one cover the make. Yeah, okay. So මෙතනදී වෙන්නේ so basically they exist in three states. First thing is the resting state. Okay, so it was -70 and a cardiac myocyte is -90. Only wage range they are resting. But there's an activation gate. So basically that is closed. Ek closed vela tiyanda sodium can't come into the cell. ඊට පස්සේ once they hit like මෙතන කියන -50 කියලා, but it's actually like -70 වගේ cardiac myocyte එකේ. I'm not exactly sure about that, just check up on that. But at a certain again threshold voltage hit to nama, this activation gate opens and sodium starts flowing into the cell. And this happens up until like plus 30 millivolts. Okay. Cardiac myocyte gonna summoning around plus 10 millivolts, plus 20 millivolts again, they remain open. Passe plus 30 වගේ ගානක් hit උනාට පස්සේ they close. But how it closes is that මෙතනදී ඒක වැහින්නේ inactivation channel එකේ. So basically when the ball valve එකෙන් තමයි ඒක වැහෙන්නේ. Again sodium can't come in. ඊට පස්සේ now up until this again then membrane potential එක -70 -90 විතර වගේ අඩු වෙනකල් the calcium channel is sorry the sodium channel is closed by this ball valve. හරිනේ. පස්සේ -70 වලට වගේ ගියාම තමයි ඒක reset වෙලා මේ valve එක වෙනුවට activation gate එකෙන් sodium channel එක close වෙනවා. So so that is the basic behavior of the sodium channel. How exactly does this correlate to like these ones, refractory periods? Then so you have the absolute refractive period. Absolute refractory period make a sodium channel close ball valve. And no matter what you do, no matter how strong an impulse you generate, you are not able to open that. Again, make activation gate voltage gate make a human make voltage you can't open it. Normally you have to stay. But then so that is why when may face absolute refractory period face no matter what you do, you can't open this thing. So that helps in preventing tetanus. That plus the prolonged calcium prolonged phase 2 so that prevents tetanus. You can have cardiac myocyte, you can heart you can a normal contraction then then you come to this thing, effective refractory phase. Effective refractory period like the sodium channels can open. The sodium channels can open, but they cannot propagate because the sodium channels adjacent to these ones are still in the absolute refractory period. Then මෙයා ERP එකේ ඉන්නවා. මෙයා ERP එකේ ඉන්නවා, but මෙයා ඉන්නේ ARP එකේ. එතකොට ඒක හින්දා වෙන්නේ you can't conduct along this side. So එතකොට ඒක හින්දා so I mean it can let sodium ions in, but propagation doesn't happen. So that's called the effective refractory period. So no matter how you try, you cannot create a conducting action potential. The next phase is relative refractory period. Now sodium channels are slowly starting to open, but they haven't opened completely. Completely open like every sodium channel opening that happens at around -70, -90 voltage open. May phase they are only like partially open. Some of them are open, some of them are closed, some of them are half open. So that phase, if you need to get to conduct an action potential, you need to give a very strong impulse. Strong impulse, you might be able to open sufficient number of sodium channels, and then conduction can happen normally. So that's ARP, ERT and RRP. Yeah, that's basically about it on like the basic physiology of the heart. These segments you guys know anything. What's important is this is important when talking about arrhythmias. PR interval PR segment QRS duration QT interval QT duration those are important things once we when we want to talk about arrhythmias. We'll talk about that later. Alright, so that's enough on that. I feel like like revising ourselves on the basic physiology of the heart. So let's now move on to like the classification of arrhythmias. I have this this huge thing is there. So this is like this is what you should use in the boards. This is the algorithm you should keep in mind. ECG how do you exactly work out the arrhythmia? We'll go through that one by one. So this is one classification of arrhythmias. So you classify into supraventricular and ventricular arrhythmias. So supraventricular everything above the ventricle. So that can include the AV node as well. So including the AV node, everything above the ventricles. The ventricular so everything below them. So can be ventricular site is Purkinje system anything. So that is one way of classifying it. Another way of classifying it is when you start classifying it. We'll go through that one first. Okay. So now the first thing is sinus node arrhythmias. Sinus node arrhythmias basically something is wrong with the SA node. SA node arrhythmia. So there are 4 sinus node arrhythmias: sinus bradycardia, sinus tachycardia, sinus arrhythmia, and 6 sinus syndrome. So sinus brady, sinus tachy, and sinus arrhythmia, all of them are normal. They are not like pathological arrhythmias. They are that's just a normal thing. That's how the heart works. 6 sinus syndrome is a pathological state. Then you have the atrial arrhythmias. Atrial myocytes වල මොකක් හරි අවුලක් හින්දා එන arrhythmias තමයි atrial arrhythmias කියන්නේ. So you have premature atrial contractions. Right? So so basically what happens in premature atrial contractions is an impulse is generated from outside the SA node. SA node normally a single beat is generated and that is propagated down to the ventricles. So that is a premature atrial contraction. Atrial tachycardia an ectopic focus, right? An ectopic focus outside the SA node starts beating on its own. So then there's this thing called overdrive suppression. SA node, basically it's the rule of the fastest drug. That's basically how it works. So SA node is the usual winner. But if some ectopic focus develops where that beats even faster, that becomes the pacemaker. So then you develop what's called an atrial tachycardia. Atrial flutter re-entrance circuit. We'll talk about that later. And then atrial flutter, and there's this thing, atrial fibrillation. Multifocal atrial tachycardia, that's a subtype of atrial tachycardia. So there's unifocal atrial tachycardia and multifocal atrial tachycardia. Unifocal, there's one single ectopic focus. Multifocal, there's like multiple ectopic foci scattered throughout the atrium. You have this thing, junctional arrhythmias. So there's AV node atrium atrial myocytes, and then SA node AV node arrhythmias. Again, there's a few. So first thing is junctional escape rhythm. Junctional escape rhythm say something happens to the SA node. Then the next highest up on the hierarchy is the AV node. So then AV node takes over, like the AV node takes up, like AV node takes over the heart, and that starts dictating the heart rhythm. That's what happens in junctional escape rhythm. Basically, the junction AV junctional It's the AV node plus the proximal his bundle. This is the junction. Okay, the junctional name. So that is junctional escape rhythm. Accelerated junctional rhythm this is some pathological state. AV node it beats faster than its intrinsic rate due to some pathology. If it starts beating at around 60 to 100 beats per minute, that's called accelerated junctional rhythm. If it starts beating more than 100 beats per minute, that's called junctional tachycardia. Then there's another thing, paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardias. Okay, the reentrant circuit, we'll talk about that. There's two types, AV nodal reentrant tachycardia and accessory pathway AV reentrant tachycardia. Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome So basically, Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome is a congenital condition. Eka hinda ina arrhythmia eka tama AVRT කියලා කියන්නේ. Atrioventricular reentrant tachycardia එකක් කියලා කියන්නේ WPW syndrome එක hinda ina arrhythmia එක. And important thing to note is WPW කියලා කියන්නේ that is not an arrhythmia. Okay? That's a congenital condition. An abnormal, that is basically an abnormal connection between the atria and the ventricles. Okay, then next thing is ventricular arrhythmias. Ventricular myocytes arrhythmia. So there can be premature ventricular contractions. Ectopic focus ventricles beat a normal His-Purkinje system beat ignore. You have ventricular tachycardias. They can be monomorphic and polymorphic. We'll talk about that later. And then there's the other thing one, ventricular fibrillation. Out of all the arrhythmias, ventricular fibrillation is the daruma maker. Basically, ventricle doesn't pump blood. Within a few seconds, you lose consciousness, and within a few minutes, you're dead. So that is the most dangerous of the arrhythmias. Another thing, Torsade de Pointe, and that is how it's spelled, okay? That's a French name. Torsade de Pointe. So that is a type of polymorphic ventricular tachycardia. Then you have these things. Conduction blocks, heart block. Heart block again, AV node hari, His-Purkinje system conduction bradycardia set. All the heart blocks, they cause bradycardia. Okay. The conduction block you get the bradycardia. So you can have certain, different types of heart blocks: first degree, second degree, and third degree. Second degree is divided into two types: Morbitz 1 and 2. Morbitz 1 is also known as Vecchi-Back block. Then there's the other thing, bundle branch block. So the heart blocks heart blocks heart block bundle branch blocks this is where you get these bundle branch blocks. Bundle branch block you don't get the bradyarrhythmia, that because the heart block you get the bradyarrhythmia. Bundle branch block you don't really get a bradyarrhythmia because so either you can get a block in the right bundle branch or you can get a block in the left bundle branch. Say if the right bundle branch is blocked here, then what happens is the left bundle branch right ventricle supply. Slowly supply but still conduction happens. Bradycardia same thing with the other side. Say if the left bundle branch is blocked here, right again, left atrium, left ventricle supply. So you don't get the true bradycardia. So that is why they are conduction defects, yes, but those are not considered arrhythmias. But we'll talk about them in this fact as well. Okay. So that is the basic overview of the different types of arrhythmias. I feel like this is the simplest way to classify it. Make a sub-classify diagram again dividing into tachyarrhythmias, and depending on the mechanism, subdivide. But this is like a very broad sort of division of the different types of arrhythmias. Okay. Now that that's done, we'll move on to the basic core principles of arrhythmias. Because the thing is, every arrhythmia develops due to just a few principles, and there's like 3 or 4 principles. So if we understand those 4 principles very thoroughly, we can apply that to almost every arrhythmia. So there's like 19 arrhythmias, 19 major types of arrhythmias. So we can apply those 3 or 4 principles. So now let's go through them. Okay, so core principles. Make among already share in a group. May notes taken there. You can go through that and annotate if you want to. Yeah, make it take some complete, but make a hundred Passadan group again full note. But this is pretty close to complete. Okay. Yeah. How exactly do arrhythmias develop? First thing is abnormal automaticity. Normal mename hierarchy can escape beat abnormally, and that starts dictating the heart's rhythm. That is basically what happens in abnormal automaticity. Then there's another thing that is called triggered activity. We'll talk about that again, what happens there. Triggered activity, there's 2 types: early after depolarization and this thing, delayed after depolarization. Delayed after depolarization. Then the next mechanism is re-entry. Re-entry circuit the arrhythmia development. So that is, so basically those are the 3 principles. Either you can have abnormal automaticity, you can have triggered activity, which is early after depolarization or late after depolarization. So delayed after depolarization, EAD or DAD. Or you can have this thing, which is re-entrant circuit development. So those are the 3 basic principles of arrhythmias. So let's go through them one by one. Abnormal automaticity is actually the easiest to understand. Like I said before, is cardiac conduction system may abnormally beat when the gun. Cardiac system abnormally rate taking beat when the gun. So that is what happens there. Okay, so let's go through this one quickly. So what happens here? Abnormal automaticity refers to spontaneous impulse generation by cardiac cells that normally should not act as pacemakers. And so this refers to things like ventricular and atrial myocytes. Right? If they are the ones who are like at the bottom of the hierarchy, normally they should never act as pacemakers, but due to some pathological states, they can start acting as pacemakers. Right? That can happen. Or excessive or accelerated firing of cells that already have automaticity. SA node, AV node. Normally rhythm dictate you only waking fire in the gun. So that is called that can also lead to abnormal automaticity. And so about them basically within a mechanism non-pacemaker cells. So they can be atrial, ventricular myocytes, or even Purkinje fibers, because Purkinje fibers ventricular muscle even they can contribute to this. Right? They start showing phase 4 depolarization and reach threshold on their own. They can basically then then pacemaker action potential cardiac myocyte action potential make his system action potential. But due to some pathological states, they can develop into this thing. They become pacemakers. That is basically what happens here. So they start showing phase 4 depolarization. Phase 4 is no longer flat. So their phase 4 is no longer flat, but now it is inclined. That is what happens there. They start showing phase 4 depolarization and reach thresholds on their own. This happens when resting membrane potential becomes less negative. Again, they thought able to minus 90 due to some pathological condition. If they go up to like minus 50, minus 60, minus 40 ranges, they can. It's easier for them to go into this state. Please, my marker size. Then it's easier for them to go into this state. or threshold becomes easier to reach, phase 4 slope increases, and we'll talk about each of those mechanisms. Okay. So this is that overdrive suppression thing I talked about. Again, non-pacemaker cells, they can acquire phase 4 depolarization. Latent pacemakers, they escape or accelerate. Arenol is a latent pacemaker, very dominant, but the guy can escape and accelerate when the pull. So that's what leads to junctional tachycardias, junctional escape rhythms, accelerated junctional rhythms. Existing pacemakers fire excessively. SC node abnormal rate taking fire. So this talks about basically the AV node. This talks about the SA node. This talks about the myocytes or the Purkinje fibers. How exactly do myocytes or Purkinje cells acquire pacemaker behavior? So these are the mechanisms. Once when they reach this phase 4 slope positive, they can incline when the membrane potential slowly drifts towards threshold and spontaneous activation potential fire and pull. Make the threshold hit action potential so one thing that can happen, one thing that can happen is less IK1 can invert potassium rectifier channel. That is what maintains this at phase 4. Phase 4 normal cardiac myocyte maintain rectifier channel. IK1 invert rectifier potassium current maintain current. This is actually current. Okay? This is not the channel again. Channel current IK1 potassium current. Anyways, the channel is not important, but outward current when there is less IK1, when there is less invert rectifier potassium current, resting membrane potential slowly it starts becoming less and less negative, and it becomes easier for them to reach the threshold. There can be increased invert currents. Sodium sodium channels should be closed. Sodium and potassium channels should be closed. But if due to some pathology, if they are open, sodium and potassium starts flowing in. And sodium leak potassium leak you can start having this membrane potential drifting on the threshold. Pathological states when cardiac myocytes they start expressing these funny channels. HCN channel express. Normally they don't have that, but due to some pathology they can have that. Sodium type action potential reach and pull. So this is pretty important. What are the conditions that can cause this abnormality? reason we go on talking about that will take a very long time, but just remember this list, and if you have time, definitely do go and find out the reason for everything. Right? So then ischemia and hypoxia can promote a state like this, because what happens there is the ischemia hypoxia so ischemia out hypoxia because of that energy generation becomes low. The ATP generation becomes low. Once that happens, the ATP dependent sodium potassium ATPase channels stop working. Then what happens is that extracellularly potassium accumulate pentagon. Normally potassium but potassium membrane slowly membrane that causes membrane depolarization, like a relative depolarization because normally so basically relative membrane depolarization threshold level hypokalemia can also cause that, because what happens there is දැන් සෙල් එක මෙහෙම ගත්තොත් සෙල් එක ඇතුලේ potassium is very high. සෙල් එක ඇතුලේ එළිය hypokalemia ඉඳ potassium is very low. එතකොට ඔතනදී තව එකක් තියෙනවා මේ අර so once again the hypokalemia වලදී hypokalemia එකක් ආවම මෙතන දැන් normally එළියට යන තියෙන මේ IK1 current එක තියෙනවා. That current actually becomes less. Now, you might think that then gradient should the current be even more here. But apparently, what happens is that when we get a cell potassium concentration when IK1 current potassium channel, they start shutting down. And that's a bit counterintuitive, but that is what happens here. So I thought, then potassium starts accumulating inside the cell. Again, you start getting a depolarization. True depolarization. Potassium that's a relative depolarization. And so basically, hyperkalemia and hypokalemia can both lead to this condition. There's drugs as well. What are these? Digoxin, catecholamines, theophylline, and sympathetic stimulation as well. Because they promote calcium entry promote the membrane potential starts drifting towards threshold. Parasympathetic withdrawal and fibrosis, scar tissue, post-MI myocardium, all of these can lead to cardiac myocytes gaining, again, going from this type of action potential into this type of action potential. Actually, I didn't have enough time to make exact specific reasons. But if you have time, definitely do go through them, and I suppose then it will make even more logical sense. Okay, so so yeah, that is basically what happens. So then what does this lead to? Then make it. So they have given either SA node fire atrial AD node fire or myocytes on it waking fire So if the SA node fires more than normal, that will lead to sinus tachycardia. Excessive sympathetic stimulation fever, hypothyroidism, anxiety, all of them lead to excessive sympathetic stimulation. Again, system, sympathetic stimulation, all these channels of IF, HCN channel, T-type calcium channels, L-type channels, potassium channels, everything opens and rate take a good So that's basically what happens if SA node starts firing abnormally fast. AV node AV junction, his bundle of his AV node and the proximal parts of the his Purkinje system, if they start firing abnormally fast, that is always pathological. Okay? That is, if they start firing abnormally fast, normal rate that is abnormal, that can lead to junctional rhythms and accelerated equioventricular rhythms. We'll talk about that later, but just keep that in mind. The atrial or ventricular muscle cells abnormally fast fire then what happens is they can lead to premature atrial contractions, PSCs, premature ventricular contractions, and focal atrial tachycardias. So then atrium group cells then they have now acquired pacemaker behavior they have acquired. So they have now acquired pacemaker behavior. Now the method SA node again fire normal beat SA node again fire normal beat may be under theatre. Randomly right? May abnormal. Maybe that gets conducted to the ventricles, conducted full contraction. So that is called a premature atrial contraction. Sometimes they can be isolated. They can problem so those are benign. They are nothing to worry about usually. Premature atrial contraction. Same thing can happen in the ventricles. Right? Ventricle එක මේ විදිහට abnormally pacemaker behavior එකක් acquire කරගත්ත cell එකක් මේ විදිහට මේ randomly impulses දෙන්න පුළුවන්. That leads to what's called a premature ventricular contraction. But those are very isolated type of incidents, nothing too much to worry about. හැබැයි මෙහෙම එකක් දැන් ඔය දැන් ඒ බෑ අර මම කියු මෙන්න මේ problems මෙන්න මේ problems ටික එච්චරම නැති states වල තමයි ඔන්න ඒ විදිහට ඉඳලා නිකන් occasionally beat එකක් යනවා වගේ දේවල් වෙන්නේ. However, if the problem is persistent, right? Problem එක persistent නම්, especially with these things, මේ වගේ structural heart diseases වලදී එහෙම ඒ කියන්නේ දැන් fibrosis, scar tissue වගේ දේවල්, those are permanent things, right? They don't go away. දැන් මෙතන sympathetic stimulation, drugs, electrolyte imbalances, අර මේවා ischemias, those are temporary things. They can resolve. But මේවා these are permanent things. ඒතකොට ඒ වගේ දේවල් වලින් it's like a permanent abnormality. They can lead to එක දිගටම බීට් එකක් යවන්න ගන්නවා වෙන්න පුළුවන්. එතකොට දැන් normally දැන් මෙතන තිබෙ SA node එකේ rate එක තිබෙ 60 to 100 beats per minute. එතකොට දැන් මෙතනදී ectopic focus එකක් develop වුණොත් permanent ඒ කියන්නේ long lasting ectopic focus එකක් develop වුණොත් say and 150 bpm beats per minute ectopic focus එකක් develop. Then this takes over as the dominant pacemaker. හරි. මෙයා overdrive suppression එකකින් SA node එක suppress කරනවා. This becomes the dominant pacemaker and this starts telling the heart this is what you should do here. So that is what we call a focal atrial tachycardia එකක් කියනවා. එතකොට ඒ කියන්නේ focal කියලා කියන්නේ this is unifocal single focus එකකින් නෙන්නේ. single focus එකකින් එතකොට single focus එකක් atrium එකෙන් generate වෙන්නේ and this is a tachycardia. Because this is 100 beats per minute. Tachy එකක් කියලා කියන්නේ if it's more than 100 beats per minute that becomes a tachycardia. එතකොට දැන් හිතන්න so that is a single focus. හිතන්න දැන් මෙතන if there's like multiple තැන් වල බුල ගිහින් කියලා there's like multiple scars in the atrium. එතකොට ඒ තැන් වලිනුත් මෙන්න මේ විදිහට ඒ කියන්නේ they kind of start competing වගේ වෙනවා එතකොට. එතකොට يعني යගෙන දැන් මම තමයි ඩික්ටේට් කරනවා. අර කියන මම තමයි ඩික්ටේට් කරන්නේ. එහෙම කිය. එතකොට ඒ විදිහට ඒ කියන්නේ අර ඒ කියන්නේ එක වෙලාවක එක්කෙනෙක් දිනනවා අනිත් වෙලාවට අනිත් එක්කෙනා දිනනවා අන්න ඒ වගේ. So that is called a multifocal atrial tachycardia එකක් තියෙනවා. So that's another type of atrial tachycardia. All of them happen because of abnormal automaticity. එතකොට මේකේ මේ exactly මේ විදිහට abnormal automaticity එන්නේ කියන මේ reasons ටික මේ පුළුවන් නම් try reading up on them a little bit more. But basically සිද්ධිය ඕක. Okay, then the next core principle, triggered activity. එතකොට okay ලස්සන කතා වගේක් තියෙනවා. එතකොට first thing is early after depolarization. එතකොට මොකක්ද උතනදී වෙන්නේ? එතකොට okay වැදගත් basically what happens here is early activation of L-type calcium channels. ඒකින්ද තමයි okay. So what happens there is දැන් හිතන්න මෙන්න මේ විදිහට දැන් ඔය L-type calcium channel එක ගත්තාම where is the L-type calcium channel first of all මෙන්න මෙතනදී හරිනේ the L-type calcium channel එකෙන් තමයි මෙන්න මේක එයා තමයි phase 2 එකේදී මේ විදිහට calcium ඇතුළට ගන්න calcium ඇතුළට එන එකෙන් potassium the outward current of potassium is balanced out right that is where the L-type calcium channel acts. And the thing to remember about the L-type calcium channel is these are like lazy fellows. They are slow to open and slow to close. And that is the central thing you should keep in mind. Activation threshold usually around minus 40 millivolts. Fast sodium channel fast sodium channel open usually around minus 70 open minus 70. I'm not sure that it's minus 70 or minus 50. Just go and check. Okay? As I remember, it's minus 70. Right? Sodium channel is minus 70. Then sodium channel so we go back to the calcium channel. The calcium channel activation threshold is minus 40 remember what I told? They are slow to open. activation threshold එක reach වුණාට මෙන්න මේ action potential එකේ මේ හරියදී ඒගොල්ලෝ actually open වෙන්නේ මෙන්න මේ වගේ තියෙන +10 වගේ හරියක තමයි open. එතකොට අන්න ඒක හින්දායි මෙන්න මේ විදිහට මේ හරියදී තමයි අර විදිහට plateau phase එක ගන්නට ඉඳ ගන්න එතනදී. දැන් හිතන්න දැන් මේ හරියදී මෙයා hit වුණ ගමන් ඒ කියන්නේ යාගේ threshold එක ආව ගමන්ම මෙයා open වුණා කියලා. දෙන්න එතකොට එකපාරට මේ විදිහට මේ මෙතන membrane potential එක ආයි බහින්න ගන්නවනේ. මේ sorry. මේ එතන ආයි වෙන ගුලක් යන්න ගන්නවනේ එතන. So that doesn't usually happen. and එතකොට එහෙම වුණොත් දැන් මේක නේ potential එක මෙන්න මේ වගේ ගොඩාක් ඉහළ ගන්නකට යනවා. and so එතකොට එතනදී ඒක නෙවෙයි වෙන්නේ. මෙතනදී even though it hits the threshold -40 here, they actually open at around this level. ඒ කියන්නේ +10 millivolt වගේ range එකේ තමයි open. Now contrast this with the sodium channel. Sodium channel එකේ activation threshold එක තියෙන usually මෙන්න මේ හරියට. හරි. නිකන් -70 විතර වගේ range එක තමයි තියෙන්නේ. එයාගේ threshold එක reach වුණ ගමන්ම එයා open. එතකොට remember sodium channels are fast opening, fast closing. Calcium channels are slow opening, slow closing. එතකොට එයා මේ වෙලාවෙම threshold එක reach වුණා මේ වෙලාවෙම open වුණා. පස්සේ මේ හරියට ගිහින් ඉක්මනට මේ හරිය hit වුණාට පස්සේ එයා close. ඒ කියන්නේ එයා +10 වගේ hit +20 විතර වගේ hit වුණාට පස්සේ they close. That is not the case in the calcium channel. The calcium channel එක දැන් 10දී open වුණා. slow opening එකක්. පස්සේ එයාද මේ විදිහට දැන් මෙහෙම ඉන්න ටික වෙලාවක් ඉඳලා slowly close back. Close back නේ. එන්න මේ වගේ 0 millivolt වගේ range එකට ආවම එයා close. හරි. එතකොට එයා මේ විදිහට close වෙනවා. close වෙලා පස්සේ මේ විදිහට මේ ඒ කියන්නේ close වෙනවා and that is the end of the story. එතකොට දැන් හිතන්න මෙන්න මේ වගේ if you ඒ කියන්නේ එතකොට දැන් හිතන්න මෙන්න මෙතනදී මෙන්න මේ දැන් මෙතන මේ window එකක් තියෙනවානේ මේ -40 ඉඳන් -20 window එක තියෙනවා. So that is usually the opening again activation threshold for the calcium channel. එතකොට ඔය range එකේදී තමයි open වෙන්නේ. හැබැයි දැන් normal action potential එකකදී එතකොට දැන් මෙයා ආපහු පල්ලෙහාට යද්දිත් මෙන්න මේ activation threshold එක reach වුණාට remember they are slow to open. ඒගේ activation threshold එක ආව එයා open වෙන්නේ නැහැ. ඒ කියන්නේ open වෙන්න කාලෙ මදි. මෙන්න මේ කාලේ පොඩි වැඩි. So එතකොට ඒක මේ විදිහට ආයි පල්ලෙහාට යනවා -40 වලින් පල්ලෙහාට ගියාට පස්සේ it can't open again because that threshold එක ආයි පන්නනවා. එතකොට ඒක හින්දා මෙන්න මේ හරියදී ආයේ calcium ඒ කියන්නේ L type calcium channels වලින් there's no contribution to that one. And so that is basically what happens in the normal physiology. එතකොට දැන් හිතන්න මෙන්න මේ වගේ if due to some reason then හිතන්න if due to some reason මෙන්න මේ දැන් මෙතනදී අපි කියවනේ මෙන්න මේ කාලය was not enough for the calcium channel to open කියලා අපි කියවනේ that is why ඒක ආයි contribution එකක් යනවා මේ විදිහට මේ the depolarization happens so the repolarization goes on without a problem. හැබැයි හිතන්න if due to some reason මෙන්න මේ phase එක extend වුණා හරි මෙන්න මේ time එක extend වුණා then what happens මෙයාගේ activation window එක කියන්නේ -40 to -20 කියන window එකේ this remains in a sufficiently long time. එතකොට අරයා even though it is slow to open it can open again because you have given enough time. එතකොට වෙන්නේ again calcium channel opens and then membrane potential starts going up again. එතකොට once membrane potential starts going up again එතකොට දැන් ඔය හරි එතකොට so now membrane potential starts going up again. එතකොට if it is sufficiently high enough that is enough to activate the fast sodium channels again. So it's a beautiful story that happens there. If that is enough to activate the fast sodium channels, then again remember මේ හරියදී sodium channels ඉන්නේ remember they are in the relative refractory period එකේ ඉන්නේ right. එතකොට they need a strong current right. They need මේ හරියදී they can activate and give rise to a propagated action potential but they need a stronger than usual current right? Because they are still in the relative refractory phase my picture මේක ඒගොල්ලෝ තාම ඉන්නේ relative refractory phase එකේ. So එතකොට now say එතකොට දැන් if that calcium the major calcium ඇතුළට එන එකේ එන positive impulse එක if that is strong enough then sodium channels again start getting activated. Sodium channels activate වෙලා again membrane potential shoots up like this. ඒ කියන්නේ phase 3 එක හරියට ඒකට හරියට මේ හරියට වෙන්නේ. මේ හරියදී so ඒකට එහෙම වෙලා membrane potential shoots up. ඒ කියන්නේ phase 3 එක හරියදීම again membrane potential starts shooting up to this level. So එතකොට ඊටම shoot up වෙලා again මෙන්න මේ විදිහට අර normal phase එකේ යන්න යනවා. මේ විදිහට ගිහින් ඇවිල්ලා ආයි then මෙන්න මෙතන again now this is slow. That problem persists due to some reason මෙන්න මේ phase එක extend වෙලා තියෙනවා. එතකොට calcium channels have enough time to reopen again. එතකොට again මෙන්න මේක happens. එතකොට again ආයි මේ විදිහට යන්න යනවා. මේ විදිහට ආයි මෙහෙම ඇවිල්ලා so that goes on in a repeating rhythm. So that is what's called this thing. මෙන්න මේ තියෙන early after depolarization එක කියන්නේ ඔන්න ඕක. හරි. So එතකොට okay consequences මොකක්ද කියලා කතා කරන්න බැරි. We should talk a little bit more about how it's that monkey then now I said magic වගේ මොකක් හරි reason එකකින් මේ විදිහට this goes up to here කියලා. මෙන්න මේ තියෙන action potential මෙහෙම තියනවා වෙනකොට it becomes something like this කියලා. Now how exactly does that happen? That can happen due to a few reasons. This is really important. Remember this one. So one thing is congenital long QT syndrome. What happens in congenital long QT syndrome? So there's like two main types, LQT1 and LQT2. LQT1 there is a defective LQT1 there is a defective මෙන්න මේ තියෙන slow rectifier channel එකක අවුලක් තියෙනවා. දැන් IKS කියලා කියන්නේ that's the slow rectifier potassium channel. මෙතනම include කරලා දෙන්නේ. So that's a delayed rectifier. ඒ කියන්නේ so basically there's two types of delayed rectifier channels. Right? Delayed rectifier channels are these ones. Right? මෙන්න මේ හරියදී මේ විදිහට potassium current එක එළියට යවන්නේ those channels are called delayed rectifier channels. Okay? Delayed rectifier channels there are two types. Rapid delayed rectifiers and slow delayed rectifiers කියලා දෙන්නෙක් ඉන්නවා. එතකොට මේ rapid delayed rectifier channel එකේ නම තමයි HERG channel එක කියන්නේ ඒකට. Third channel එක කියන්නේ ඒකට. And the current that goes through that channel is called the IKR. එතකොට දැන් LQT1 වල මෙන්න මේ මෙතන තියෙන slow rectifier calcium slow rectifier potassium කියලා should be potassium. Okay, මෙතන තියෙන slow rectifier potassium channel එකේ තමයි අවුලක් තියෙන්නේ. Basically that is absent. එතකොට what happens when that is absent? Then මේ විදිහට මේක slope එක decreases. දැන් මේ විදිහට ඉක්මනට පල්ලෙහාට බහින්න this starts becoming prolonged. That leads to the condition I mentioned here. මේ විදිහට මේක extend වෙනවා. එතකොට ඊළඟට the next one is LQT2. They are IKR. ඒ කියන්නේ rapid delayed rectifier channel එකේ අවුලක්. That is this one. Right? Okay, අවුලක් ගියාමත් again same thing happens because both of them contribute to that. Phase 3 එකට. So that is what happens in a long QT syndrome. So that is congenital. You can have acquired long QT syndrome as well due to QT prolonging drugs. QT prolonging drugs are basically drugs that block the HERG channel. මෙන්න මේ තියෙන HERG channel එක block කරලා IKR IKR කියලා කියන current එක block කරන drugs වලට තමයි අපි කියන්නේ QT prolonging drugs. So this is a must know class of drugs. Okay. So again ඒක block වුණාම වෙන්නේ same thing. මෙන්න මේ විදිහට මේ QT එක prolong වෙන්නයි වෙන්නේ. එතකොට what are those drugs exactly? So they include class 3 antiarrhythmics. Right? So you have amiodarone, sotalol, dofetilide, dronedarone, or medical. This is why you might have heard the phrase antiarrhythmic drugs themselves can cause arrhythmias. So this is the reason. You can also have the primary culprit is class 3 antiarrhythmics, and class 1A antiarrhythmics have a moderate block as well. So they include quinidine, tropinamide, disopyramide, etc. You can have other drugs blocking the HERG channels as well, and they include they can cause long QT syndrome, can cause arrhythmias, drugs, etc. This is what happens. So you can have your macrolides, erythromycin, erythromycins, propranolols, azoles, antipsychotics, haloperidol, antidepressants, tricyclic antidepressants, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, antiemetics like ondansetron, domperidone, or katti okkoma, they can cause acquired QT, acquired long QT symptoms. You can also have this thing, hypokalemia and hypomagnesemia contributing to this. So what happens there? Hypokalemia basically hypokalemia අර මම කද කලින් කිව්වා. So hypokalemia එකේදී වෙන්නේ extracellular potassium is low. right? Blood potassium is low and therefore the extracellular fluid එකේ potassium is low. right? So එතකොට when extracellular potassium falls, these channels again අර මම කිව්වා IKR and IK1 කියන currently conduct කරන channels, they conduct less. right? Again, it's a bit counterintuitive, but earlier potassium ප්‍රමාණය අඩු වෙද්දී those channels get inactive. And even though the gradient seems to be larger. එතකොටත් වෙන්නේ ඇතුලේ there's a positive build up. එතකොට ඒ කියන්නේ මේක ඇතුලේ cell එකේ membrane එක you don't let it depolarize. You don't let the membrane depolarize. You keep it at a positive level. Again, phase 3 prolongation happens. What happens with hypomagnesemia? Hypomagnesemia වලදී වෙන්නේ this thing. So intracellular magnesium, and they act as physiologic calcium antagonists. So they reduces the open probability of L-type calcium channels. Right? Again, normally what happens is normally intracellular magnesium, they close the calcium channels. When you have hypomagnesemia, again, blood magnesium is low, extracellular magnesium is low, and therefore intracellular magnesium is low. These calcium channels, they open up even more, and then even more calcium starts flowing into the cell, and the membrane potential becomes positive. So again, the method is it's a constant battle between potassium and calcium. In hypomagnesemia, calcium kind of wins the battle. So again, QT interval and phase 3 they become prolonged. And by the way, phase 3 corresponds to the QT interval. Yeah, so that's one reason. And another thing is bradycardia. Bradycardia, again, bradycardia can prolong this thing. Phase 3 prolong bradycardia. Because yeah, you can just keep that in mind. Reason a little bit, but it's here. So, but anyways, maybe the bradycardia, maybe the slope becomes decreased, right? The slope it becomes like this. Right? So, phase 3 becomes prolonging bradycardia. Right? So, the bradycardia itself can lead to this thing early after depolarizations. Right? Okay. Yeah, so that is basically what happens in a early after depolarization. So then you'll ask like, so what happens? This is what happens. Now an EAD can evolve into all of this. When they can evolve. An EAD can evolve into nothing. If the conditions are not good enough, right? Then so that can cause a small depolarization during phase 2 to 3, but the inward current is insufficient to reach threshold. And again, sodium channels, relative refractory phase, sodium channels activate that current is not enough. Right? So then, nothing happens. It just dies away. Right? So those are common, clinically silent, and so basically, maybe get body depolarization so maybe the product but it's not enough to trigger the sodium channel. So I thought taking the EDM maybe fall down yeah. So that's a failed early after depolarization. Okay. Or they can evolve into a premature beat. Then became a early depolarization maybe a single beat generate. The conditions are not good enough for the long run, but it can generate a single beat. Right? Maybe a single beat generate that single beat can go and produce a premature atrial or ventricular contraction. Due to abnormal automaticity, premature atrial or ventricular contractions can be generated here. This is another mechanism. Early after depolarizations can also generate premature atrial or ventricular depolarizations. But they mostly generate premature ventricular contractions. Premature atrial contractions don't usually happen with EADs. Usually what happens is a premature ventricular contraction. So nothing can happen. A single premature beat can happen. If the conditions are good, conditions maintain this can evolve into a sustained, sustained, and that is this. You can evolve into a tachycardia. That's called a triggered tachycardia. So triggered tachycardia, trigger because you need action potential you need a basic make it a trigger event. That's why it's called a triggered activity. But you can get what's called a triggered tachycardia. So these triggered tachycardias can be atrial or ventricular tachycardias, but since EADs mostly occur in the ventricles, they are usually triggered ventricular tachycardias. Okay. This can, so that's a tachycardia, and that is a monomorphic tachycardia because it has the same type of beat. So therefore, that's a monomorphic tachycardia. But it can also become a polymorphic tachycardia as well. We'll talk about that later. So it can evolve into a we'll need to talk a little bit more about the mechanisms. Again, specific arrhythmia we need to know before we understand this. I'll keep that for now, and we'll discuss that later after we have discussed those are the point ventricular fibrillations and re-entry mechanisms. Okay, so basically that is what happens in an early after depolarization, and that is a certain type of triggered activity. Okay. We now move on to delayed after depolarizations. So remember, early after depolarizations usually happen in phase 3. They say phase 2 will happen. I'm not sure how that happens, but phase 3 will usually there. Then we go to delayed after depolarizations, and those are abnormal things that happen in phase 4. Phase 4. So what happens there? Again, there's a beautiful mechanism to it. So let's go through that. So that basically happens due to intracellular calcium overload. So delayed after depolarizations are abnormal depolarizations that occur after the action potential has fully repolarized. Phase 4 if large enough, they can also trigger extra beats and maybe lead to arrhythmias as well. Okay, so step-by-step mechanism. Now the central thing is you have calcium overload inside the cell. This can happen due to digoxin toxicity. And remember, this is why we learned that digoxin can cause arrhythmias. Digoxin itself is an antiarrhythmic, but it can cause arrhythmias as well. This is how. Right? For the digoxin, what happens? Again, how does that lead to calcium excess? Right? Basically, what happens is, digoxin gihilla, So you have digoxin. Digoxin inhibits the sodium-potassium ATPase channel. Once you remember we are talking about the cardiac myocytes. Okay, these things, this early after depolarizations, they happen in the cardiac myocytes, atrial or ventricular myocytes. Same with delayed after depolarizations. So the myocyte ATP, sodium-potassium ATPase pump is blocked. Intracellular sodium levels start going up because this pumps them outside and pump intracellular levels go up. Now there's another channel called the NCX channel. That's the sodium-calcium exchanger. It takes sodium in and sends potassium out. Sends calcium out. දැන් මෙතනදී sodium වැඩි වුණාම වෙන්නේ මෙතන දැන් sodium වැඩි. Sodium වැඩි වුණ හින්දා මේ gradient එක වෙන්නේ නැහැ because the gradient doesn't exist. ඒක හින්දා මෙන්න මේ flow එක like sodium flow from outside the cell to inside the cell doesn't happen. So now coupled to that is calcium exit. Then calcium exit එක වෙන්නේ නැහැ. Then calcium levels start going up. Once calcium levels start going up, the thing that happens is cell එකatulle there's the sarcoplasmic reticulum. These are contractile cells. You have the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that is filled with calcium. And in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, you have what's called a ryanodine receptor. The ryanodine receptor is a ligand given an ion channel, and the ligand is calcium. එතකොට මෙන්න මේ calcium ඉහළ ගියාම this goes and binds to the ryanodine receptors, right? And the ryanodine receptors open, and that causes a massive release of calcium again. Right? So that is called calcium-induced calcium release. Right? That is again normal muscle contraction. Again, this happens, but through a different mechanism. Right? This is calcium-induced calcium release. Give me a second. Yeah, so that's what happens here. Then so you get an overload of calcium. Once you get an overload of calcium, yeah, so you start getting an overload of calcium. So then maybe get a calcium overload එක කියන හින්දා membrane potential එක let me start doing this. So that may hari give me a second. Yeah, මෙන්න මේ හැටි. දැන් මෙහෙම ඉද්දී phase 4 එකේ man's ඉද්දී calcium starts leaking out. කියන්නේ sarcoplasmic reticulum එකේ දැන් ගොඩක් calcium enter. එතකොට again membrane potential starts going up. Now say the membrane potential goes and hits -70. -70 hit to gaman, this shoots up. Right? This shoots up and another action potential is generated. That is what happens in a delayed after depolarization. Harinam, the next regular sinus beat should come here. And me hariba again. Now, methanadi, Kalin Venareka, purely due to the abnormal membrane potential caused by calcium release. Right? Yes, okay. So that is what happens in a delayed after depolarization. Again, maybe the delayed after depolarization doesn't reach threshold. -70 reach when it slowly dies away. Maybe it reaches -70 and generates one single beat. Or it can progress into a tachycardia as well. Okay. So there are other reasons for this as well. High catecholamines, right? Again, stress exercise link, sympathetic stimulation, releasing high catecholamines can cause calcium overload inside the cell. Again, there's a mechanism here. Okay, go and read up on it. I mean, but everything is explained here. Okay, then so then calcium release and sympathetic stimulation. What happens there is then so you have the beta adrenergic receptor, and then you have it coming and binding here, and it ultimately activates protein kinase A through a signal cascade. Protein kinase A goes and activates the calcium channels. Intracellular calcium goes up. Intracellular calcium goes up. Sarcoplasmic reticulum releases calcium, and then spike it up. That's what happens there. Ischemia reperfusion state. Ischemia followed by reperfusion can also cause calcium overload. Again, mechanism I mentioned here. Hypercalcemia, that's obviously the cell calcium is high, that can cause this. Rapid heart rate can also cause this one. It might be important because so what happens there is, so have a heartbeat, take a contract vendor, you can make it calcium so so that is proportionally with every beat more calcium comes into the cell. Then what happens is when the heart rate goes up, right, in rapid heart rates, key point is here. Right? Diastole shortens more than systole. We need to talk a little bit about how calcium metabolism happens inside the cell. Let's go through that bit here. Right? So when the calcium comes into the cell, right? Calcium comes into the cell. This is calcium current. So calcium can come in like this as well. Calcium goes and triggers the Ranadine receptors, and the sarcoplasmic reticulum releases calcium. Calcium goes and binds to myofilaments and causes contraction. And because physiologically it goes and binds to the myofilaments or tropomyosin, it's exposed again. Myosin head bind in a site exposed. That sequence all happens there. Mitosis or contraction happens. So contraction calcium is spontaneously released from the myofilaments. Then what happens is that you have the Circa pump, SCRCA. Circa pump, that is again the sarcoplasmic reticulum. That's an energy-dependent pump, active pump. So that pumps calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This calcium can also go through the calcium, go outside the cell through active transport as well. You have the NCX channel as well, sodium calcium exchange. You can send calcium out and sodium in. That is balanced by the sodium potassium ATPase pump, which sends the sodium back out again. This calcium can go inside the mitochondria as well. So that's another mechanism by which calcium is sequestered. So that is how normal calcium metabolism happens. The rapid heart rates are the systole ekata vada diastole shortens more than systole. Then what happens is, but systole ekedi tama NCX pump calcium pumping out of the cell and sequestering the calcium inside the Circa pump. That all happens during diastole. But now when diastole is more shortened than systole, there's not enough time to sequester away all of the calcium inside the cell. So slowly calcium starts building up inside the cell, and ultimately you can reach this phenomenon like a delayed after depolarization at interpol. So that's rapid heart rate you can get a delayed after depolarization. Contrast this with this one, early after depolarization. That happens with bradycardias, right? Because bradycardias lengthen the phase periods, and therefore you start getting the early after depolarizations. Bradycardia, early after depolarizations. Tachycardias can cause delayed after depolarizations. Remember that. And okay, so basically that is what happens in a DAT. What's the fate of DAT? So the DATs can also have these fates. Now, a DAT can evolve into nothing. Nothing can happen again if it doesn't reach the threshold. Sodium channels threshold reach it happens again, just dies away. Or it can evolve into a single ectopic beat. It can evolve into a single ectopic beat. It can evolve into a triggered tachycardia. Right? Again, tachycardia evolve if the conditions are good. It can become sustained and become a tachycardia. You call that a triggered tachycardia. Right? Because it happens through triggered activity. Triggered activity. So that can happen. And another thing to remember, DADs can happen in both atria and ventricles. Can happen in both. This thing, re-entry mediated arrhythmia, we still take it. So we'll keep that and we'll raise this and talk about that again. Trigger tachycardia bidirectional catecholinergic polymorphic they can degenerate further into polymorphic VTs and VFs as well. We'll talk about that later. Just keep them for now. And so now we have finished two core mechanisms. Normal automaticity, triggered activity, which includes delayed after depolarizations and late and early after depolarizations, right? Those can cause arrhythmias. There's one thing remaining, and that is the re-entry circuits. Right? What happens in a re-entry circuit? There's another beautiful thing happening there. Right? Re-entry circuits. Re-entry circuits, what happens there is... I think this picture is the easiest way to understand this one. So then, in an ideal state, all of the tissue in the heart should be like uniform. Again, everything should. Again, the ventricle, we take a section of the ventricle out, should function in the same way. So if you give, the segment ventricle segment maybe the impulse do not. Ventricles ventricle segments, if they are perfectly normal, not just ventricles, this heart tissue, if everything is normal, ideally they should nicely divide like this and go along like this. Equal timings or conduction should happen. But in some pathological states, certain areas of the heart can become abnormal, while the adjacent areas are relatively normal. The homogeneous nature of the cardiac muscle of the myocardium is lost, and it becomes heterogeneous. Then what happens is you get slow conducting zones and fast conducting zones. Fast conducting zones is actually the normal conducting zone. But in addition to that, due to pathological states, you can get slow conducting zones. Right? So what are these pathological states? These pathological states include fibrosis, stretch, inflammation. What happens is this can lead to the separation of myocytes, disruption of gap junctions, and the reduction in sodium current speed. That ultimately that leads to a slowing of the conduction. The conduction speed slow. So the conduction slows. But the weird thing is slow conducting zones recovery period is faster. If we draw an action potential, the action potential is usually something like this. We have something like this. Slow conducting zone. So that this thing. ERPA, effective refractory period, is actually low. Why does that happen? That happens due to another phenomenon that happens simultaneously. Electrical remodeling. So I've got electrical remodeling, especially if this is chronic. Ignore the atrial part. Atrium search chronic, especially chronic disease. Acute taker, you not make a winter pulvan, electrolyte imbalances. What happens there is you have an increase in outward potassium currents. Right? Potassium rate cell depolarizes faster and decreased L-type calcium currents. Right? Cell calcium again cell depolarizes faster. Tattoo phase tattoo phase it becomes something like this. Okay. So that because of that, you have a shorter action potential in these slow conducting zones. When you have a slow action potential, that means automatically your effective refractory period is also going to be low. Right? So you have these zones. You have a slow conducting zone which has a short refractory period, and a fast or normal conducting zone which has a relatively long refractory period. Right? Then now say an impulse comes. The impulse comes down like this. Now you have a slow conducting pathway and a fast conducting pathway. this happens especially if the impulse is premature. Premature atrial contraction premature ventricular contraction that is one method that can happen, but say basically some kind of premature trigger, right? Premature trigger the normal tissue, the normal fast conducting tissue, that still hasn't recovered because its effective refractory period is long. Is still recovered. But the thing is, this impulse is premature, but the slow conducting zone, because its effective refractory period is shorter, it has already recovered. If this was also perfectly normal here, make it fully normal now, this would also stay in the effective refractory phase. This would also stay in the effective refractory phase, and premature nothing would happen. This would get blocked out. But slow conducting zone, fast recovery zone, that allows the impulse to propagate slowly, right? Because pathway is slow, so the impulse conducts slowly downwards. Then what happens? Then the normal refractory, the normal conducting tissue has already recovered. Again, then ERP then ERP will pass. Now this is ready to receive another action potential. Then what happens is, action potential divide normally but retrogradely goes up the fast conducting zone. Right? Retrogradely goes up the fast conducting zone. Point reach. Point man's eye bifurcated. Either retrogradely signal. Then the trick this was the slow conducting zone, but its effective refractory period is short. Therefore, it has recovered fast. Then this bugger has recovered. Now it is recovered in the eye goes down, and the cycle continues. So the cycle continue because it is slow, it has already recovered. State bifurcate signal fast conducting zone has already recovered by this time, therefore it goes up again. So this goes up like this, bifurcates and sends a signal upwards. Slow conducting zone has a fast recovery time, therefore it has recovered, and then it goes down, gives a down signal, and then goes up again. But on my way, maybe you get a round signal. So that is what happens there. Then the thing is, this conduction loop is very short. This can instantaneously go and come back here again very fast. And atrial conduction tissue needs to come into here. But it needs to go only through here. Compared to this person who has to go this way. This rate is almost always, it's always faster than this one, right? Faster than the normal atrial rate, faster than the normal SA nodal rate, always fast. Usually 150-200 beats per minute rate over 100. So that can cause another arrhythmia. Usually tachycardia almost always tachycardia. So that is another mechanism by which tachycardias, arrhythmias can occur. So that is basically a re-entry circuit. So that is basically it. And a re-entry case, so what do you need in a re-entry circuit? This is important. 3 fundamental properties we need. 2 pathways with different properties. Slow conducting and so unidirectional block in one pathway. There is a unidirectional block because there are short and long refractory periods. One is still refractory while the other has recovered. Slow conduction in the other pathway, slow conducting pathway, faster. That is the central thing you need for a re-entry circuit. The re-entry circuit, the other thing you need is a trigger එකක් ඕනේ. මේ විදිහට trigger එකක් ඕනේ. Usually premature මොකක් හරි impulse එකක් you usually need for the circuit to start. And the other thing is මේ විදිහට මෙන්න මේ වගේ suitable substrate එකක් ඇවිල්ලා තියෙන්නත් ඕනේ. Suitable zone එකක්. Fast and slow conducting zones තියෙන suitable substrate එකක් ඇවිල්ලා තියෙන්නත් ඕනේ. ඔය ඔක්කොම වුණා you have the formation of a re-entry circuit. Right? එතකොට then මෙතන I've given a whole list of what can act as the triggers of a re-entry circuit. Right? එතකොට triggers ගැන කතා කරන්න කලින් I have also given what are the substrates that can form a re-entry circuit. Right? So එතකොට they can be structural or anatomical causes. Right? එතකොට දැන් අපි අර කලින් කිව්වා due to fibrosis, scar tissue, cardiac hypertrophy, chamber dilation, congenital anatomical part, congenital anomalies. You can have like due to structural issues themselves, you can have slow conducting and fast conducting zones. You can also have due to conduction abnormalities, you can have slow conduction and fast conduction zones capable. පස්සේ ඊළඟට එතකොට මෙතන මේකත් every Hamilton explanation didn't really have time with it, but that is the basis of it. You need a suitable substrate. Right? A substrate that is capable of re-entry. There's a lot of reasons why they can be formed. Right? All of them are given here. Right? Then you need a trigger for the re-entry circuit to start, and that trigger can be an early after depolarization as well. Again, EAD එකක් හෝ DAD එකක් වුණත් can act as a trigger. The EAD එකක් එනවා, so EAD nicely comes down. It needs a certain area where there is slow and fast conducting zones. එතකොට EAD එක මේ විදිහට ඇවිල්ලා start කරනවා re-entry circuit එක. And EAD එක හෝ DAD එක මේ විදිහට re-entry circuit එකක් start කරනවා. That is why මෙන්න මෙතන DAD එකකින් එන්න පුළුවන් re-entry mediated arrhythmia එකක් එන්න පුළුවන්. මෙන්න මේක කියන්නේ. So triggered tachycardia එකක් කියන්නේ by itself. ඉන්න තැනම normally where the EAD was born, you have the generation of a tachycardia. Re-entry mediated arrhythmia එකක් කියන්නේ උදන් පල්ලෙහාට එන්න ගනිද්දී it encounters an area of slow conduction and fast conduction and forms a loop. That is a re-entry mediated arrhythmia, and usually that is a tachycardia. So there are two ways by which an EAD or an EAD can cause a tachycardia. That's a triggered tachycardia or a re-entry mediated tachycardia. The same thing for EADs. Initiation of re-entry circuit. That is what I talked about here. Okay. So that is EAD. EAD, DADs can act as trigger. Then premature ventricular complexes. Again, PVC, premature ventricular contraction, the same thing. PVCs, PACs can also act as triggers. PACs and PVCs can be generated from abnormal automaticity being generated. නැත්තම් අපි කලින් කතා කරා වගේ EAD එකක් හෝ DAD එකකින් උඩ generate වෙන්න පුළුවන්. So we said EAD or DAD can generate a premature beat. මෙතන මේක this can generate this thing. DAD can generate a single ectopic beat. That's a premature ventricular atrial contraction එක generate වෙන්න පුළුවන්. So that එකක් වුණත් can come and act as a trigger for that re-entry circuit එකට එන්න පුළුවන්. පස්සේ ඊළඟට abnormal automaticity වලින් PVC, PACs and පුළුවන් කියන එක මෙතන තියෙනවා. The re-entry self important trigger source දෙක තියෙනවා. හරි. පස්සේ ඊළඟට those are the main ones. අනිත් ඒවාත් ඔයගොල්ලෝ මේ go and read. So that is basically so that's all. Again, those are the basic mechanisms by which arrhythmias are generated. Okay. Now let's take a break of like 10 minutes and then we'll restart because again now that we talked about all the basic mechanisms of arrhythmias, we can now go on to talk about each and every individual arrhythmia. So that is Today we'll talk about sinus node arrhythmias and then junctional arrhythmias, AV node and the what was it? Sinus node, junctional levi and re-entrant. No, that. Sorry. So sinus node, atrial arrhythmias and junctional arrhythmias. So 11 arrhythmias the rest of them, the other 8, we'll talk about. Right? Okay, so let's take a break for now, and we'll meet again at 9:55 again.